So you want to buy an airport, a captive monopoly on the only way in or out of a city by air, planes landing constantly, every single one paying you a fee just to touch down. Here's the part nobody tells you. Where you decide to put that airport, a decision made once, on paper, years before a single runway is poured, can determine whether the entire project becomes one of the most profitable infrastructure assets on the planet or a multi-billion-dollar monument that never recovers. And once that decision is made, there is almost no way to undo it. Let's start with how ownership of an airport actually changes hands, because it rarely works the way people assume. Governments generally sell or lease airports one of three ways: an outright sale, a long-term concession running 40 to 99 years, or a partial public stock offering. The concession model has become the dominant structure worldwide because it lets a government raise enormous sums of money without fully giving up the underlying asset. When investors value an airport for one of these deals, they're typically looking at a multiple of somewhere between 15 and 23 times the airport's annual EBITDA, and that multiple assumes something crucial. Not what the airport earns today, but what it will earn over the coming decades, because once a concession is signed, the buyer effectively controls a monopoly position in that city for the entire length of the contract. Now, where does the actual money come from once you own the thing? The first category is aeronautical revenue, landing fees charged per aircraft weight, a per passenger charge, and fees for parking planes at the gate. This sounds straightforward, and it would be extremely lucrative if left alone, except that almost every government on Earth heavily regulates how much an airport is allowed to charge airline, precisely because the airport is a monopoly, and an unregulated monopoly could simply charge whatever it wanted. Regulators cap the number, and the number regulators land on is reliably lower than what the airport would prefer. Because aeronautical revenue is capped, every serious airport operator has built a second business inside the first one, and this is where the real profitability of the industry actually lives. Non-aeronautical revenue, parking, retail concession, food and beverage, real estate leasing, hotel operations accounts for a substantial share of total airport income globally, and critically, it isn't subject to the same regulatory ceiling that aeronautical revenue is. Retail tenants inside a terminal typically sign contracts guaranteeing the airport either a fixed minimum payment or a percentage of gross sale, whichever is higher, meaning a slow month for the duty-free shop still generates guaranteed income, and a great month means the airport takes a cut of every additional sale. This is the actual engine of airport profitability in the modern era. The runway gets you the monopoly. The shops behind security are where you actually make the money. Here's the part of the business that almost nobody planning an airport from scratch takes seriously enough, and it's the single decision that ends up mattering more than construction budget, terminal design, or even which airlines eventually agree to fly there. Location, specifically how connected that location is to the population center it's supposed to serve. An airport isn't just competing with other airports, it's competing with the psychological and practical cost in time and money of actually getting there, and that calculation gets made by millions of individual travelers every single year for decades, long after the runway is finished and the ribbon has been cut. There's a story that shows exactly how catastrophically wrong that calculation can go, even when the government backing it has essentially unlimited resources and genuine confidence in the plan. In 1975, the Canadian government opened Montreal Mirabel International Airport, roughly 34 miles north of downtown Montreal, on land the government had expropriated from local farming families years earlier. The vision was extraordinary in scale. Mirabel was meant to become the primary gateway for international air travel into Canada, designed to eventually handle up to 50 million passengers a year, a figure that would have made it one of the busiest airports on the planet at the time. The government believed international bilateral aviation agreements would force most transatlantic and international flights to funnel through Mirabel specifically, locking in demand almost automatically. It never came close to working. The airport airport's distance from the city, combined with the fact that a promised high-speed rail connection to downtown Montreal was never actually built, meant travelers faced a substantial cab or drive time simply to reach the terminal at all. Passenger numbers never came anywhere near projection. By 1988, the airport was processing roughly 2.5 million passengers a year, while Montreal's other, more centrally located airport was still handling more than 2.6 times that volume in domestic traffic alone. At its absolute peak, Mirabel never handled more than 3 million passengers annually, a small fraction of the 50 million it had been designed and funded to accommodate. By the early 2000s, the airport was running an annual operating deficit of roughly $20 million, and in 2004, international passenger service was discontinued entirely. The terminal building, which had cost well over $1 billion to construct, sat completely vacant for a decade before the airport authority finally announced it would be demolished, judging the structure no longer economically viable to maintain, let alone reopen. Today, Mirabel survives only as a cargo and aircraft testing facility, a fraction of what it once was. Here's the structural lesson buried inside that collapse. Mirabel didn't fail because the terminal was poorly built or because demand for air travel into Canada disappeared. It failed because the single most important variable in airport economics, proximity and connectivity to the people who are actually supposed to use it, was decided wrong at the very beginning. And once tens of millions of travelers had established a decades-long habit of simply not choosing that airport, no amount of retail concessions or landing fee adjustments could ever reverse it. You cannot fix a location decision after the runway is already poured. Now compare that to an airport built with almost the opposite philosophy from day one. Singapore's Changi Airport was developed with an explicit understanding that the airport itself needed to become a destination, not just a transit point people tolerated on their way somewhere else. By the late 2000s, non-aeronautical revenue, shops, food, and beverage, hotels, parking had grown to represent 55% of the airport's total revenue, more than half the entire business coming from something other than planes landing. In the fiscal year ending in 2009 alone, Changi generated 1.23 billion Singapore dollars in revenue and a net surplus of $284 million, and that non-aeronautical revenue base gave the airport something almost no other major hub had at the time: real financial flexibility. Changi used that flexibility strategically, freezing landing fees and offering discounts to airlines specifically to attract more traffic and more route, a move few competing airports in the region could afford to match because few of them had built a retail and commercial ecosystem strong enough to absorb the lost aeronautical revenue. That strategy compounded over decades. The airport later built Jewel Changi, a multi-dimensional retail and attraction complex integrated directly into the terminal experience, which alone drew more than 80 million visitors in a single recent year, a number that actually exceeded the airport's own passenger traffic for that period. People were now traveling specifically to visit the airport itself, independent of whether they were flying anywhere at all. Changi didn't just solve the non-aeronautical revenue problem, it turned the airport into a tourist destination in its own right, something Mirabel, sitting isolated and disconnected 34 miles outside Montreal, could never have replicated. No matter how many shops it built inside a terminal nobody wanted to travel to in the first place. The difference between these two outcomes wasn't the ambition of the governments involved, and it wasn't the quality of the construction. Both were extraordinarily expensive, extraordinarily ambitious infrastructure projects backed by national governments with genuine confidence in their own vision. The difference was proximity and integration. Changi sits close enough to Singapore and connected well enough by transit that building an enormous retail and leisure destination around it made the entire trip worthwhile, even for people who weren't flying that day. Mirabel sat far enough from Montreal, with a promised rail link that was never delivered, that no retail strategy in the world could have overcome the basic friction of simply getting there. One airport turned its location into a strength that non-aeronautical revenue could amplify. The other tried to build non-aeronautical revenue on top of a location that undermined the entire premise from day one. That brings us to the structural risk sitting underneath this entire industry, and it isn't operating costs, security mandates, mandates, or even the regulatory caps on aeronautical revenue, real as those pressures are. It's the fact that an airport's most important economic decision, where exactly to put it, gets made decades before the full financial consequences become clear, and is essentially irreversible once tens of millions of dollars in concrete and steel are already in the ground. An airport built in the wrong place doesn't get a second chance to relocate. It spends the rest of its existence trying to compensate for a decision that can't be undone through retail concessions, discounted landing fees, or desperate attempts to lure airlines that would rather fly somewhere more convenient. Zoom out across the industry, and the pattern becomes obvious. The airports that thrive over the long run are almost never the ones with the most ambitious construction budgets or the grandest original vision. They're the ones where location and connectivity were treated as the actual foundation of the business model, not an afterthought to be solved later with better marketing or cheaper fees. The airports that fail are almost always the ones where planners assumed regulatory agreement, government mandates, or sheer optimism about future demand would be enough to overcome a fundamentally inconvenient location. The exact assumption that turned Mirabel from Canada's gateway to the world into a cargo facility and occasional film set within 3 decades. So, does owning an airport actually work as a business? The honest answer depends almost entirely on a decision made before you ever collect your first landing fee. In the optimistic version, you own or develop an airport genuinely well connected to the population it serves. You build a non-aeronautical business substantial enough to fund competitive landing fees and attract growing airline traffic. And that combination compounds for decades, the way Changi turned itself into a destination people visit, regardless of whether they're catching a flight. In the realistic bad version, you own an airport built on an assumption about future demand or political leverage that never materialized, positioned somewhere travelers were never actually going to choose on their own, and no amount of retail strategy or fee discounting can undo a location problem that was locked in the moment construction began. Neither outcome has much to do with how large or ambitious the original terminal design was. An airport was never really a bet on air travel growing. It's a bet made once, permanently, on whether the specific plot of land you chose was actually the place people wanted to fly into in the first place.